be given by Donovan. Donovan is giving the talk, and it's about racial justice. So I thought of Martin Luther King. You can never go wrong with, I see there's something on the screen, but I guess that's nothing. Okay. All right. So I thought Martin Luther King would be a perfect quote for us today. I think perhaps he spoke these words at a commencement, but I think they're very, they apply to all of us at all times. And it's, as always, very poetic. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. For it isn't by size that you win or fail. Be the best of whatever you are. I just think he always says it so well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, I now have the great pleasure of introducing Donovan Rodriguez, today's speaker. And Donovan doesn't know this, but I want to give a little preface to his speech to tell you how this came about. About 3.5 years ago, I went on a trip with about 50 people, led by my rabbi, to the Deep South. We went to Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham. It was to educate us about the history of the civil rights movement. In the 1960s, during the time of some of the major civil rights movements and legislation, I was busy getting married, having a kid or two. I was generally turned inward, concerned primarily with myself, despite, of course, having an awareness of the news. And in fact, Schwerner, Cheney, and Guttman, unfortunately, were killed on my wedding day. So yeah, I was aware, but not so much. So I wanted to take the trip, and it ended up just having a profound effect on me. We heard a lot of people speak at several different sites. We crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which almost sounds trite, but I can't tell you how moved we all were. We visited large and small museums, including the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, which in my opinion, everyone in the United States should visit. But the place that had the greatest impact on me was 2 rooms, very modest. It was the Freedom Riders Museum, a former Greyhound bus station. And I looked at the exhibits there, and I suddenly found myself in tears because I remembered things suddenly. There was a young John Lewis, and people, doing sit-ins at lunch counters who were my age at that time, who had put their lives on the line in the name of civil rights. And I came home thinking that had I been Black, I would have been angry. I would have been militant. I probably would have been a Black Panther. So I wondered, what can I do now that perhaps would not just make me another bleeding heart liberal? And so suddenly this opportunity came along through Rotary. And that's why I asked Donovan to chair our new committee for racial justice and equity. And so Donovan, would you please take it from here?
So much, Jackie. And thank you, members of the Rotary, for giving me the opportunity to speak about the committee. The Racial Justice and Equity Committee, I'm hoping that we'll be able to make some headway into learning more about racial injustice and inequities in America, but more importantly in Englewood. What is racial justice? According to the National Education Association, racial justice is the systematic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. Racial justice, or racial equity, goes beyond anti-racism. It is not just the absence of discrimination and inequities, but also the presence of deliberate systems and supports to achieve and sustain racial equity through proactive and preventative measures. What is equity? Equity is you're given the tools that work for you. Equity is fairness. Equity is providing access. And I'm going to give you some examples to illustrate the distinction between equity and equality. Okay, so slideshow, where are you? Here we go. Okay, so here we see a picture on the left and a picture on the right. If you look, you'll see the young man in the purple shirt. This young man in the purple knows just how important the difference between equality and equity can be. You see on the left, we have three people. Two of them, they all have equality. They're all on the same height stool. And the fence to the baseball game is the same for everyone, but they are of different heights, as you can see. The gentleman is taller, then there's a little boy in the middle, and then the little man in the purple shirt can barely see unless he peeks through a hole in the fence. However, if we take a crate from the tallest one and give it to the smallest one, and we stack the crates on top of each other, then the smallest one can now enjoy the game like everybody else. That is equity. Here's another example of equality versus equity. Similar to the first one, in the first image, it is assumed that everyone will benefit from the same supports. They are being treated equally. In the second image, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game. They are being treated equitably. And in the third image, all three can see the game without any supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity was addressed. The systemic barrier has been removed. Here again, we have all four individuals are given the same size bike. That's equality. But one individual is in a wheelchair and so cannot get on a bike. Another individual, the bike is just too small for him. The lady with the long hair, it works perfectly for her. And then there's a kid, the bike is just too big. And for equity, everyone receives the tool that works for him or her. So we see the lady in the wheelchair is now given a bike that works for her. The tall man is given a bigger bike, and the little fellow is given a smaller bike. That is equity. Here's some examples again of equity. Let me just move this out of my way. There we go. Examples of equality and examples of equity. A city cuts the budget for 25 community centers by reducing the operational hours for all centers by the same amount at the same times. That's equality. Equity is the city determines which times and how many hours communities actually need to use their community centers and reduce hours for centers that aren't used as frequent. Another example of equality, a community meeting where all members of the community are invited about a local environmental health concern is held in English, though English is not the primary language for 25% of the residents. And I'm sure we can identify with that here in our own community in Englewood. Equity would be the community leaders hire translators to attend the meeting or offer an additional meeting held in another language. Final example of equality, all public schools in a community have computer labs with the same number of computers and hours of operation during school hours. Equity would be the computer labs in lower income neighborhoods have more computers and printers, as well as longer hours of operation, as some students don't have access to computers or internet at home. And I will stop sharing my screen now. So as we just illustrated that there is a stark difference between equity and equality. Equality is where all are given the same tools. Equity is where each person is given the tools that work for him or her. Equity is not equality. So this year, the coming year for the committee, with the help of the other committee members, I'm hoping that we would consider focusing on equity and access. We're going to look at what's the urgency, what's in the way, who is included and left out in the making of policies and decisions that will impact minority groups. What will it take? I'm hoping that we will be able to look at the data, perhaps even do an equity audit. We will need to analyze data on the whole community. We look at mental disorders, discrimination that people face, median income data, access to quality education, access to healthcare, the ability to access care, treatment, life expectancy. According to Leslie Curtis, the chair of the Department of Population Health Sciences at Duke University School of Medicine, life expectancy is a range of factors, according to him, the range of factors that play into life expectancy include income inequality, the social safety net, as well as racial inequality and access to healthcare. We may do a trauma audit. We look at the whole community, the effects of historical racism, ACEs, meaning adverse childhood experiences, help mitigate these issues through trusted organizations. So first we look at the data, and then we help to mitigate some of these issues by using the resources we have in our community. We will look to transforming trauma, shift from communities that harm to communities that heal. We'll screen for trauma, we'll screen children and adults for ACEs, we will conduct childhood youth survey, we will look at racism in education. For example, Brown versus Board of Education pretty much decimated Black teachers in the South. And so we have today, most Black and brown kids do not have teachers who look like them. So we will look at how policies are designed from a white perspective and to provide equality, but not equity. We will look at zero tolerance policy that fueled the school to prison pipeline. We will look at how school funding from property taxes affect public schools in lower income neighborhoods. We will look at structural racism like redlining, mass incarceration, and lack of access to funding. We look at our criminal justice system and the racist history of policing. And we will provide solutions for reforms, right? Reforms simply do not acknowledge racialization, racism, or whiteness, even as they avow a commitment to equity. And the example I gave you was Brown v. Board of Education. And to paraphrase David Gilhorn, reforms that are silent on race and racism and that are controlled by the values of whiteness can be considered as acts of white supremacy. We must be cognizant that racism is produced through everyday practices. I'm hoping that the committee, as a committee, we will propose preventative community care. We will look at restorative practices, social and emotional learning. We'll aim to develop community repairing harm by building relationships, social discipline. We will move away from punitive to restorative. We will look at having more diverse judiciary, look at economic policies that close the wealth gap, bread and butter economic issues like jobs, healthcare access, and sufficient housing. We look at police reform, I hope we will even be able to look at the George Floyd bill, George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We look at racial equity laws, criminal justice reform, how cash bail criminalizes poverty, how incarceration shapes the lives of Black children and their families. We look at the environmental impact, look at our policies and how are they perpetuating bias and inequities. Where do we see bias, discrimination, and injustice in our community? How do we have systems and practices that anticipate these problems? And what can we do to reach out to families and be proactive? It's critical to know if the parents have literacy skills or even speak English. And we have a large Hispanic population. How are we serving that community when they barely speak English? And some of their children are not literate in their native language. How do we help those kids to assimilate into our public school system? We look at federal and state policies that impact our society. And we will look at different forms of reparations for racial justice. And when I say reparations, I don't mean giving people money. There are many ways in which we can help to reverse the traumatic effects of systemic racism in our society. Finally, I'll give you a quote from Professor Matsuda. Our inability to think structurally with a sense of mutual care is dooming us, whether the problem is racism or climate disaster or world peace. Thank you. Any questions, please?
Thank you, Donovan. Yeah, we will take.
Donovan, I have a quick question.
Okay, wait.
I'm not sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, we'll start with Hillary.
I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, but a few minutes ago, did you say something to the effect that in the public school, Black students have mainly white teachers?
Yes, I did say that.
Okay. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Does that
Yes,
create
yes,
inequity?
yes, it does. It does.
Yeah.
You have there is a cultural difference. There are cultural differences between Caucasians and African Americans and Hispanic, and there are unconscious biases based on one's upbringing, and these things affect students. Boys who only see female teachers are affected by that psychologically. Black children who, for whatever reason, may have a distrust of people who are different. It affects how they approach their lessons. You have teachers who may, because they probably haven't done professional development and sensitivity training, may use language and words and even unconscious action that can make Black and brown children feel inadequate and feel that they don't have access. So it does affect, and the data has shown that it has had a tremendous impact on children.
Donovan, I must be an exception because when I was in graduate school for a few years, I taught in Harlem in a special service school, which had very, very difficult children. I think they used to call them 600 schools, where many of the children were going from Spofford to Rikers, really, really difficult children. I taught French. I had the most incredible rapport and loving and caring with those students. It was really, I really felt that the color of the skin did not determine the level of expertise and empathy and compassion that a teacher has for his or her students. At the time, it was a very active time for the Black Panthers, and I had several meetings with Malcolm X and some of the leaders of them, and I welcomed them to come to my classrooms and watch how I was teaching. Every one of them thought that I was doing a wonderful. I mean, I didn't just teach them. At lunchtime, I had everybody sit in my room. I helped them with the homework. On the weekend, I would pile them into my car, take them to Central Park to ice skating, take them to bike riding. It was like they were my extended family and we were so close. So I'm not sure that what you're saying should be universally applied to every white teacher.
Well, I mean, what you did is highly commendable, but you're just one person. And the other thing issue is the first thing you said was they were difficult children. So you've already labeled these kids, and there's a perception that you have of who they are, which may not necessarily be accurate.
Oh, no, no, I
but
labeled
you're
them.
Yes,
These
but
are-
let me finish. So taking them on trips and treating them with love and kindness is wonderful, but that doesn't mean you don't have unconscious biases towards these kids, especially the fact that you find them to be difficult, however you define difficult.
I didn't
Yes,
define them as difficult.
yes.
These are students that came from Spofford, which was a correctional facility.
But still, you're
They
just one
came in
person, and
special
and
If I may,
and
if I may-
many teachers don't necessarily treat their children the way you did.
obviously, there are going to be individuals who are fabulous and wonderful.
Exactly.
And, you just, Donovan must speak in generalizations at the moment in what he's describing, but there's no question that there are individuals who do not fit that mold. But I take your point. I would like to go on to Diane and then Bob.
And I have a question too.
Okay.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Donovan. Donovan, you've taught me a lot. We've had discussions early on about racism and bias and equity.
Yes.
And I've grown a lot since that time where we might not have agreed on things. But anyway, the comment I would like to say is you've covered a broad brush. Do you see the committee developing a report that can then be used as an educational tool within our Englewood community? For instance, there is a lot of data that we can get from the census. There's a lot of data that we can get from the schools. There's a lot of data that we can get from the health department. And based on that data and comparisons to county, state, and US data, we can show where we stand. Do you see it working in that fashion? And then perhaps picking one area to zone in on? Thank you.
You've nailed it, Diane. That's exactly what I'm hoping to achieve by looking at the data, the census data, and then making recommendations and to take a very practical approach to our findings and make meaningful suggestions and policy changes. So you are perfectly correct. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Bob and then Janet.
Yes, Donovan, my friend. I sent you an email. I have to pop off after your talk, but I have a million questions for you.
Yes.
Much too long for today, so I would like to humbly ask you, lunch will be on me.
I'm looking forward.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
And
Bob.
take care all. I have to run. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Bob.
Bye now.
I will respond
Bye.
to your email.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Janet, please.
I just had a comment that it might be a good idea to give the committee some and other members some homework, such as watching the movie 13th about the criminal justice system, the inequities in the criminal justice system, and also True Justice, which is a documentary about Brian Stevenson, who's really been a pioneer in racial justice in the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Janet. That's brilliant. Yes, that's the next homework.
And also, I think you know that there is a racial justice, Coalition for Racial Justice, Racial Unity and Equity in Englewood, that it would be good. And there's several members of Rotary who are already involved in that. So
Yeah,
we can all work
I
together.
think, doesn't Shelley Wimpheimer chair it?
She sort of convenes the group. Scott, I can't remember Scott's involved. I know that Steve is, Shelley certainly. I can't remember who's in Rotary.
I would like to see us
Can you
have,
send me some info?
yeah, I
Sorry,
would like to see us have a connection to it. Makes sense rather than duplicating effort. Excuse me, is there anybody else who has a question or comment?
Can you send that? Can you send information on this racial equity group in Englewood?
Yes, please. Can
Sure.
you join it? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and so, yeah, so if you give that information to me or to Mitch, then the next time a mailing goes out, it can be included. And I can put it in the end of the month newsletter.
Okay, yeah, I'll send it.
Okay, so I'm really fired up, Donovan. Thank you so much. You know,
Thank you. Too.
I've never been able to define in my own head what equity meant. And thank you so much for clarifying that for us, because I was never comfortable with it before, only because I didn't know what it was. So makes utter complete sense.